Trinidad Coal Hills, Colorado, August 1894. The sun beat down with high-altitude fury, baking the pinyon-juniper scrubland to a crisp, uniform brown. In the narrow valley where the company had laid out its grid of miners' lots, most men were still underground, chasing the black seams of the earth. But one man was working above it, with the earth itself. His name was Luigi Bertini, and what he was doing made no sense to anyone. He was building a house without lumber, not a soddy, which men from the plains understood, nor a stone house, which was honest if laborious work. Luigi was building with dirt, and not even the good black topsoil, but the dense reddish clay marl he'd excavated from his own foundation hole. He worked between two parallel wooden forms, about 2 feet apart, dumping in barrows of moistened earth, straw, and gravel, then tamping it down with a heavy iron-shod log. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was rhythmic, alien. It was the sound of a fool compacting his own failure. Hawthorne Rusk, the tally clerk for the Purgatoire Valley Coal Company, paused on his way back from the tipple. He was a man of ledgers and sharp pencils, a man who believed in right angles, sawn lumber, and predictable outcomes. He watched Luigi, a wiry man with a dense mustache and forearms corded from labor, methodically pounding dirt inside his strange, 8-sided foundation. "Bertini," Rusk called out, his voice dry as the dust in the air. "I've tallied board feet, and I've tallied tons of coal. I have yet to see a column in my ledger for pounds of mud." A few other men, their faces permanently smudged with coal dust, had gathered. Silas Croft, a timberman who set props in the mines, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice. "Heard in the company store you're building a mud hut, Luigi. That true?" Luigi paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. He nodded once. "It is piece de terre," he said, the Italian accent shaping the words into something foreign and soft. "Rammed earth." "Rammed foolishness is what it is," muttered Abel Keene, a mule skinner. "That thing will melt in the first spring rain. Be a puddle by April." Rusk stepped closer, peering at the low, thick wall rising from the foundation. It was already a foot high, a solid, monolithic block of compressed earth. "I'll give you this, Bertini. It's a novel way to bury your family before they're dead. That earth will draw the damp straight up from the ground. Capillary lift, they call it. My wife's geraniums do it in the pot. You'll be sleeping on cold mud, and your children will have lung fever before Christmas." He delivered the pronouncement with the unassailable confidence of a man who knows how the world works. Everyone knew a proper house was a box of wood sealed with tar paper and nails. This 8-sided mud pie was the work of a crazy man. Luigi simply looked at Rusk, then at the wall, then back at his tamper. "The walls will be dry," he said, his voice quiet, almost indifferent. He picked up the heavy log. "And they will be warm." Then he returned to his work. Thump, thump, thump. The men shook their heads and walked away, chuckling. The story of the Italian's mad mud house was already becoming a fine piece of local humor. What did this Piedmontese earth builder, a man who had spent his life raising earthen farmhouses in the Cuneo Valley, understand about thermal mass and geometry that these seasoned coal country carpenters, men who lived and died by the qualities of wood and the ferocity of a Colorado winter, had so completely missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn the simple, profound physics of a building that breathes with the fire, holding its warmth like a memory. If you've ever felt a draft in a modern home and wondered if there was a better way, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. And tell me in the comments, what's the strangest, most clever old-timer building trick you've ever seen? Luigi Bertini was not a carpenter. He was not a miner. And he was certainly not a frontiersman in the American sense. He was a muratore in pise, an earth mason from the foothills of the Alps, a region where wood was scarce and the lessons of thermal physics were encoded not in textbooks, but in the walls of barns and houses that had stood for 500 years. His hands understood the language of clay, the right moisture content for a perfect compaction, the sharp grit of sand that gave it strength, the binding power of straw. He knew the deep, resonant thud of a properly rammed layer, a sound that meant no air pockets, no weakness. His tools were not saws and hammers, but heavy iron tampers, sliding wooden forms called casseri, and a deep, instinctual knowledge of how a mass of earth could absorb the sun of August and hold it deep within its core, against the frost of January. He had come to Colorado with his wife, Elena, and their two small children, Marco and Sophia, drawn by the promise of high wages in the coal fields. The company recruiter in Turin had not mentioned the winters. Their first, in 1893, had been a lesson in sheer survival, spent in a standard-issue board and batten company shack. That winter had been a physical entity, a predator that lived inside the house with them. Luigi remembered the boot oil in its can, thickened to a waxy sludge, so the cracked leather of his boots drank it like dust, leaving no sheen. He remembered pouring a tin cup of coffee, only to see it skin over with a thin, greasy film of cold before he could raise it to his lips for the first sip. The worst was the silence of the parlor organ Elena had insisted on bringing from home. It was her one connection to the life they'd left, to evenings of music and community. One morning in December, she had sat down to play a carol, and the keys were frozen solid, stuck midway through a C major chord. The music itself had frozen in the air. The cold had stolen their songs. That was the moment Luigi swore they would not spend another winter as prisoners in a wooden box. He would not fight the cold with more coal, a battle of brute force he was destined to lose. He would build a shelter the way his grandfather had taught him, a shelter that didn't fight the cold, but simply remembered the heat. The conventional failure of the Trinidad miners' cabins was a matter of simple physics, repeated in dozens of identical structures. They were built for speed and economy, not for thermal performance. A single layer of vertical pine boards was nailed to a light frame, and the cracks were covered with thin strips of wood called battens. There was no insulation. The wind, a constant presence in the foothills, found every gap. It was a sieve for heat. The problem wasn't just the drafts. The problem was the walls themselves. Wood has a low thermal mass. It cannot store significant amounts of heat. The moment the fire in the cast iron stove died down, the heat it had produced radiated straight through the thin wooden walls and was lost to the night. Families were engaged in a frantic, losing battle, feeding the stove constantly. A man would come off a 10-hour shift in the mine, only to spend his evenings splitting wood or hauling coal just to keep the frost from creeping across the floor. They were burning fuel not to warm their house, but to warm the entire state of Colorado. Silas Croft's family, living 2 lots down from Luigi's, was a perfect example. They burned through their winter allotment of company coal by mid-January. Silas spent his evenings stuffing rags and old newspapers into the cracks around the window frames, a futile gesture against the relentless infiltration of cold. His wife kept a pot of water simmering on the stove at all times, not for cooking, but because the steam added a tiny bit of humidity and warmth to the air, a desperate defense against the dry, searing cold that chapped lips and cracked skin. At night, they slept under a mountain of blankets and still woke with their breath pluming in the air. This was the accepted reality. Winter was misery. A house was a thin temporary barrier against it. Luigi's project began to take its strange shape through September and October. He laid a foundation of river stone, mortared with lime. Rising a good 18 inches above the ground, this was his answer to Hawthorne Rusk's fear of capillary action, a stone barrier the ground moisture could not climb. Upon this, he and Elena set the sliding wooden forms for the first layer of the octagonal walls. The octagon was not a whim, it was geometry in service of survival. Luigi knew from his ancestors that a circle encloses the most area for a given perimeter, but a circle is difficult to build. An octagon was the closest practical shape. For the same square footage as the Croft's rectangular cabin, Luigi's 8-sided house would have 11% less exterior wall surface. It was a simple, elegant reduction in the area through which heat could escape. The process was brutally laborious. They dug the clay, mixed it with sand from the creek bed, and straw from a nearby rancher, adding just enough water to make it clump. Then, the tamping began. A 6-inch layer of loose earth went into the forms, which was then pounded down to 3 inches of dense, rock-hard material. Layer by layer, the walls grew. Each of the 8 panels was 24 inches thick. At the corners, where the panels met at a 135-degree angle, Luigi employed a technique his father had used. He embedded wooden timbers, lime key half-laps, that tied the adjacent panels together, preventing any separation as the massive walls cured. The town watched, the mockery turning to a kind of grudging curiosity. Hawthorne Rusk made a point of stopping by each Saturday. He couldn't help himself. The project offended his sense of order. "You're tamping your own tomb, Bertini," he said one afternoon, watching Elena pass a bucket of the clay mixture to her husband. "When the spring thaw comes, that ground will heave, your foundation will shift, and these magnificent mud walls of yours will crack right down the middle. You'll have the first 8-sided ruin in Colorado." Luigi paused his tamping, leaning on the ram. He looked at the perfectly plumb, solid wall, then at Rusk. "In my valley," he said calmly, "the houses stand for centuries. The earth does not move. The earth remembers." Elena, hearing the criticism, called down from the scaffolding in her clear, melodic Italian. "Mr. Rusk, do you think God gave us the good earth only to dig under it? We think he meant for us to live with it too?" She smiled, a gesture that disarmed Rusk more than any argument. He just shook his head and retreated to his world of straight lines and predictable numbers. By the first snowfall in November, the walls were complete, a massive monolithic octagon of reddish earth rising 8 feet high. A heavy timber roof structure was put in place, and in the exact center of the single large room, Luigi built a stone hearth with a chimney going straight up. The house had no interior walls. The central fire would radiate its heat in all directions, striking the face of every one of the 8 walls equally. The house wasn't just a container for heat. It was an active part of the heating system. To understand why Luigi Bertini's house worked, you have to understand 2 fundamental principles of physics that were as real in 1894 as they are today: surface-to-volume ratio and thermal mass. One is about geometry, the other about material. First, the geometry. Imagine you have a certain amount of floor space you want to enclose, say 600 square feet. If you build a long, skinny rectangle, you will have a huge amount of exterior wall space. If you build a perfect square, you reduce that wall space significantly. A square is more efficient than a rectangle. But a shape with more sides, like an octagon, is even more efficient. And the most efficient shape of all is a circle, which encloses the most area with the least perimeter. Luigi's octagon was a brilliant compromise. Compared to a square cabin with the same 600 square feet of living space, his 8-sided design had 11% less wall area, exposed to the brutal winter cold. That's an 11% reduction in heat loss right from the start before you even consider what the walls are made of. It was a simple geometric trick for outsmarting the cold, but the real genius was in the walls themselves. This is the principle of thermal mass. Thermal mass is an object's ability to store heat. Think of a black rock in the desert sun. It absorbs heat all day long, and if you touch it after sunset, it's still warm. It is slowly releasing the heat it stored. Now think of a piece of black paper next to it. It gets hot in the sun, but the moment a cloud passes, it's cool again. It has very little mass, so it can't store heat. A standard wooden cabin wall is like the piece of paper. It's lightweight. It provides a barrier, but it has almost no capacity to store heat energy. The heat from the stove hits it and passes right through. Luigi's walls, on the other hand, were the rock. They were 2 feet thick and made of pisé de terre, which, when cured, weighs about 110 pounds per cubic foot. A single 8-foot-tall, 10-foot-wide panel of his wall weighed over 9 tons. The entire structure was a massive, dense battery for heat. When Luigi lit a fire in his central hearth, he wasn't just heating the air in the room. He was charging the battery. The infrared radiation from the fire streamed out in all directions and struck the dense earthen walls. For hours, the walls soaked up this energy, thousands upon thousands of BTUs. The surface of the wall would feel warm to the touch, but deep inside that 24-inch thickness, the heat was slowly, steadily accumulating. Then, when the fire was allowed to die down to coals for the night, the process reversed. The air in the room would begin to cool, but the massive walls, now warmer than the air, would begin to release their stored energy back into the living space. It wasn't a blast of heat like a stove, but a gentle, steady, radiant warmth that emanated from every direction. The walls themselves became the radiators. Luigi calculated that the walls had enough mass to continue releasing comfortable levels of heat for more than 38 hours after the fire went out completely. He wasn't just building a house, he was building a climate. That January, the winter came for them. It wasn't a blizzard, with howling winds and burying snow. It was something more sinister, something the old-timers called a sangre de Cristo radiative freeze. For 13 straight nights, the sky was crystalline, utterly clear and black, filled with stars that seemed to burn with cold fire. With no cloud cover to act as a blanket, any heat on the earth radiated directly into the infinite cold of outer space. The temperature plunged to 29 degrees below zero and stayed there. There was no wind, only a profound, penetrating stillness. The cold was so deep and metallic that the stovepipes on the company shacks would contract and ring faintly, a high, lonely hum, as if struck by a celestial tuning fork. In the Croft cabin, the misery was absolute. Every nailhead in the walls was white, with a perfect circle of interior frost. The water bucket was frozen solid by the door. The family lived in a small circle around their stove, which glowed a dull red, devouring coal at an alarming rate. To leave that circle was to enter a world of Arctic cold. Inside Luigi Bertini's octagon, a different reality existed. The fire in the central hearth was kept burning modestly during the day, then banked to a bed of glowing coals at night. There were no drafts. The air was still and calm. The thick earthen walls, charged with a full day of radiant heat, had become a gentle, silent source of warmth. In the morning, hours after the last flames had died, the interior temperature was still a comfortable 65 degrees. The children, Marco and Sofia, slept peacefully in their beds, not buried under piles of blankets. The ultimate proof, the small domestic detail that proved the entire theory, sat on their kitchen table. It was an earthenware cruet of olive oil, brought from Italy. Every day, Elena would unstop it to dress a simple salad of winter greens. The oil, a deep, viscous green, poured in a smooth, clean stream. It was a small act of impossible normalcy. 2 lots away, the cook at the company commissary had a large tin of pomace olive oil he used for frying. It was a solid, yellow puck of fat. To get any out, he had to chip at it with a chisel and hammer, sending frozen shards skittering across the floor. In Luigi's house, the oil flowed freely. The cold had not been allowed to win. Hawthorne Rusk was a man of duty. As tally clerk, it was his job to account for every car of coal that left the rail siding for the smelters in Pueblo. The siding was 2 ridges over from the miners' settlement, an exposed, wind-swept place, even on a calm day. On the 10th night of the radiative freeze, he was caught out late, double-checking a manifest under the light of a kerosene lantern. The cold was unlike anything he had ever felt. It was a physical weight, a pressure that seemed to squeeze the air from his lungs. His gloved fingers grew numb, and a dangerous lethargy began to creep over him. The company office was a half-mile away, a journey that suddenly felt impossible. He looked across the moonlit snow and saw the strange, dark shape of Bertini's 8-sided house. It was the closest structure. He felt a pang of scorn, then a surge of pure survival instinct. At the very least, the thick mud walls would block the constant radiative heat loss from his body to the black sky. Stumbling through the deep, powdery snow, he finally reached the east-facing panel of the house. He leaned his back against it, expecting to feel a surface as hard and cold as frozen rock. He was preparing for the shock of it, but the shock never came. What he felt through his thick wool coat was nothing. Not cold, not the biting, energy-sucking chill of every other surface in this frozen world. He pressed a gloved palm flat against the wall. It was not just neutral, it was discernibly, undeniably warm. He pulled off his glove, his fingers stiff and aching. He pressed his bare hand against the wall's surface. It was smooth, hard as stone, and radiating a faint, steady heat like a hearthstone, hours after the fire has gone out. It felt alive. In that moment, the world of numbers and ledgers, of bored feet and right angles, dissolved. This wall was breaking the laws of winter as he understood them. Driven by a disbelief so profound it bordered on revelation, he pressed his cheek against the earthen surface. He closed his eyes, feeling the gentle, life-giving warmth seep into his frozen skin. It was the most comfortable thing he had ever felt. The next day, Rusk walked to Luigi's door. He didn't knock. He stood for a moment, looking at the seamless, powerful walls. When Luigi opened the door to fetch a log, he saw the tally clerk standing there, his face pale and serious. "Bertini," Rusk said, his voice stripped of its usual certainty. He didn't offer an apology, he asked a question. "How?" Luigi gestured for him to come inside. The wave of calm, even warmth, that enveloped Rusk was stunning. There was no hot spot near a stove, just an enveloping comfort. The children were playing on the floor in their shirt sleeves. Rusk looked at the simple fire, then at the immense thickness of the walls visible in the window casements. He ran his hand along the interior surface. It was smooth, plaster-like, and warm. He turned to Luigi, a slow understanding dawning in his eyes. He wasn't just seeing a wall. He was seeing a new principle. "You didn't build a wall, Bertini," Rusk said, his voice quiet with awe. "You built a hearthstone 8 feet thick." Word of Hawthorne Rusk's conversion spread faster than a grass fire. When a man of numbers abandons his ledger for a truth he can feel with his own cheek, people listen. The mockery directed at Luigi Bertini curdled into respect, then into outright demand for his knowledge. He was no longer the crazy Italian. He was the man who had tamed winter. The story found its way to the ears of the editor of La Voce del Popolo, the Italian-language newspaper that served the immigrant communities across southern Colorado. The editor, a progressive-minded man from Denver, traveled to Trinidad, interviewed Luigi, and published a full-page article in the February 1895 edition, complete with a detailed diagram of the octagonal floor plan and a cross-section of the Piece de Terre walls. Simultaneously, the local chapter of the Società Vittorio Emanuele, the Italian mutual aid society to which Luigi belonged, recognized the profound importance of his work. Their mission was the welfare of their members, and nothing impacted that welfare more than surviving the brutal winters. They printed Luigi's plans in their monthly newsletter, a simple mimeographed document that was passed from hand to hand in the mining camps. Luigi, a quiet man who had never sought recognition, found himself hosting delegations of miners on Sundays, patiently explaining the proper mixture of clay and sand, the method of tamping, the importance of a stone foundation. By the time the spring thaw finally came, the thaw Rusk had predicted would melt the house into a puddle, Luigi's walls stood as hard and dry as kiln-fired brick, and across the coal hills new foundations were being laid. In the camps near Pueblo and Walsenburg, families of Italian miners, armed with the plans from the newsletter, were beginning to build their own 8-sided houses of earth. The idea spread not through official channels of architecture or engineering, but through the grassroots network of a community desperate for a better way to live. Luigi had offered them more than a building plan. He had offered them a measure of freedom from the tyranny of the cold and the constant draining expense of fuel. Luigi Bertini's octagonal house was more than a clever frontier innovation. It was an almost perfect, intuitive application of building science principles that wouldn't be formalized for another 75 years. Modern sustainable architecture, with its focus on passive solar design and thermal mass, is essentially a rediscovery of the wisdom that Luigi carried in his hands. Today, an architect designing an energy-efficient home would speak of the building's thermal envelope and its ability to act as a heat sink. They would use computer models to calculate the ideal R value and the precise amount of thermal mass needed to maintain a stable indoor temperature. Luigi did it with instinct, experience, and a tradition passed down through generations. He understood that the most powerful force in architecture is not the furnace, but the flywheel, the mass that smooths out the peaks and valleys of temperature, absorbing excess energy and giving it back when it's needed most. His pièce de terre walls were a massive, passive thermal flywheel. The quiet revolution he started in the Trinidad coal hills is a testament to an idea we are only now relearning, that the most elegant solutions are often not about adding more power, but about wasting less of it. The earth itself, the very substance people were paid to dig through and discard, was the key to their comfort and survival. In the end, the story of Luigi Bertini is not about a new way to make fire. It's about a new way to think about walls. The other miners saw their cabins as thin shields, pitifully inadequate defenses against the onslaught of winter. They believed the only solution was to burn the fire hotter, faster, longer. Luigi saw the problem differently. The challenge wasn't to produce more heat, but to conserve the heat you already had. He didn't burn the fire faster. He carved walls that kept the fire working for 2 days after it stopped. He built a house that remembered the flame, holding its warmth in a massive earthen embrace, long after the coals had turned to gray ash. The mockery of his neighbors lasted for a season. The wisdom of his walls stands to this day. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and physics valuable, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode. And remember to share your own stories of clever old-world solutions in the comments below. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to apply these or similar building techniques today should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all modern building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.